Like, just because you're not a celebrity, just because you don't have a camera on you already, doesn't mean you don't have something to say, and doesn't mean that you can't have a following or be influential. And of course, social media has since become a thing, so I think that's more true than ever before. But part of that is realizing that as a, poor Asian kid who didn't have money for Abercrombie and Fitch and American Eagle and what have you growing up, that despite all of that, you could carve a niche for yourself based on your ideas. And that is so powerful. And I think especially as a female, so powerful to realize it's not about your looks, it's not about the brand of your jeans, but you can actually captivate people with your ideas and make a difference.
This is the Visible Voices podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Amy Faith Ho, an emergency medicine physician, informaticist, and storyteller. Dr. Ho is a chief systems and informatics officer specializing in the EHR, that's the electronic health record, the integration of that is, audience, clinical databases, data models, analytics, and the intricate world of billing, coding, and revenue cycle. You can bet AI in healthcare is on the agenda. A self-proclaimed nerd, I am too, audience, who believes that dedication plus passion plus pursuit equals nerd, I love that formula, she is a self-proclaimed science geek and bookworm. P.S. Me too. Dr. Ho has taken her message to 5 TEDx stages. She's argued that guns and violence will be the next women's movement. She's explored how disease serves as the great equalizer and has called for compassion even in the face of hate. She celebrated embracing your inner nerd, and she shared a story of numbers, challenging us to let life define our numbers rather than letting numbers define our lives. Beyond the emergency department and the data, Amy is passionate about health policy, medical humanities, podcasting, storytelling, and writing. Amy, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Resa. I'm super excited to chat about all these things.
I'm so glad you're here with me today. Okay. The name of the podcast is The Visible Voices. When did you think you realized you had a voice, and when did you start using that voice?
Man, isn't that like a work in progress? Like, we are always trying to decide that we have a voice that is worth sharing is probably the key part. I actually entered healthcare because I was so appalled by the insurance industry. When I was in high school as a high school debater, we researched this topic for a whole year. And I was like, wow, there's a whole industry, billions of dollar industry in this country where we give them money just so that when we actually need them, they deny and say, we are not here for you. So this concept just struck me at my moral core. And I got extraordinarily impassioned about healthcare advocacy. Ended up going to medical school because I wanted to understand the inside scoop on the healthcare industry. And then luckily found emergency medicine. So I was about to be a consultant, actually not practice medicine, but luckily found emergency medicine and fell in love with patient care. So my reason for being in medicine has actually always been because I thought there was a story here of something to uncover and share to everyone.
Yeah. The voice. You said back in high school, you had this, call to action regarding the insurance industry. What about that made you stand up or speak up or write up?
So I was born in the United States. My parents are immigrants. They immigrated from Taiwan to United States in their 20s for my dad to go to school. And I mean, it's the classic story. Came over with one suitcase. They bought a twin bed. My dad slept on the mattress on the floor. My mom slept on the box spring on the floor. And they did that for decades. And that's how I grew up. So when I had this concept of the American dream, like why my parents left everything they knew to come to try to achieve, it just felt so unfair. Like, you have an industry that you were told is going to provide something. You give them your trust. You give them your hard work. You work hard for the money that you give them. And then they are not there for you at one of the most fundamental things that you need, which is your body, your health, your well-being. And so I think it was the combination of seeing how my parents grew up. And I grew up pretty poor. Feeling that when I was young, like, we don't have enough to do X, Y, or Z. And then realizing that people are taking advantage of these vulnerable populations. And I was emboldened, and I think very, very much taught that I was extremely blessed to be born in the United States as a citizen with English as my first language. And I felt I needed to do something with that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about growing up poor and how that contributed to your voice. And actually, you shared that you did debate. I wish
Mhm.
debate had been offered in my high school. I think I would have been so into it. But that helps from what I've seen people really realize their voice as well.
Yeah, I think there is this concept when you grow up. I mean, I grew up before social media was a thing. So you turn on the TV, you see famous people talking, and there's this concept that there's a hierarchy of people important enough to be broadcast. And then all of us that just turn on the TV and, pick the channel. And I think what was really interesting about debate to me is that we were a bunch of, I don't know, 12, 13, 14-year-olds talking about really important things like nuclear warfare, healthcare, climate change. And, we had judges that were college students, sometimes older teachers, that listened to us. And we made really almost congressional sort of style concepts about policy, and people listened. So to me, that was probably my first step in realizing that your voice can be a great equalizer. Like, just because you're not a celebrity, just because you don't have a camera on you already, doesn't mean you don't have something to say, and doesn't mean that you can't have a following or be influential. And of course, social media has since become a thing. So I think that's more true than ever before. But part of that is realizing that as a, poor Asian kid who didn't have money for Abercrombie and Fitch and American Eagle and what have you growing up, that despite all of that, um, you could carve a niche for yourself based on your ideas. And that is so powerful. And I think, especially as a female, so powerful to realize it's not about your looks, it's not about the brand of your jeans, but you can actually captivate people with your ideas and make a difference. Mhm.
So, with your work in informatics and electronic health records, revenue cycles, where, and if you can give maybe, let's start with one specific way that you see AI playing a role.
So AI is definitely here. I think the two biggest AI products that I see are one, AI scribing, which is functionally ambient scribing. Whether it's integrated with or without the EHR is a separate question. But in function, you have your phone or the room is set up such that it can record and listen to the conversation, and then it scribes it just like a scribe following you around would into a history, physical, medical decision making, which I think is really fascinating. And then also sometimes advice for the provider, i.e., hey, tell me how did I do from a patient experience standpoint. So I
And
think,
for audience members, sorry to interrupt, but audience members who aren't familiar with, what it's like for us. So say it's a physician, the physician, to your point, has a conversation, we'll say, with a patient and with a phone or the listening in the room, the ambient listening, that conversation is put down into the electronic health record. In other words, there's a pre-typed draft of a note. And so on the plus side, you're like, oh, that means the physician can actually look and pay attention to that conversation with the patient. Or they don't have to, worry about keeping up on all their charting because some of that charting is done. So there's a potential huge number of positives here.
of course, and I think the physicians and APPs that I know that are using these products, and I use them at one of my hospitals as well, absolutely love it. It is great. You can coach it to what you need, but it opens up the questions again of compliance, liability. What happens if something is documented incorrectly? I think it opens up a really interesting question for me on the informatics side, which is in informatics, I am very reliant on structured data. So what that means is, clicky buttons, drop downs, and so on. When you have these AI platforms, they create a giant free text blob, almost like a Word document. So you lose all of that from a data extraction perspective. So then what do you do about that? All that being said, AI scribing is absolutely here. Many, many products, many, many very good, many backed by huge companies like Microsoft, Epic, et cetera. And I think uh, that is something that we are only going to see expand.
You brought up about liability.
Mhm,
Dr. Sarah Jabauer, who is an AI subject matter expert, anesthesiologist, she talked about at this point the way things are, ultimately we're liable if it's,
mhm.
which makes sense. It's our note, it's our chart, we're signing it, we're liable. And so, how much do you worry about that, or do your healthcare team members worry about that, the AI and the liability?
Given my role for a large physician group, I worry about it a lot. As a physician working shifts, love it. Like, it is so nice. Like, the notes look good. I do try to be really careful. on reviewing them really explicitly the same way I would about, working with a human scribe. But again, try is the natural function. I'm sure we miss things here and there because it happens when you work with normal scribes. But I think the liability component is, of course, we are responsible for what is in the chart. And I think that's always been the case, even with human scribes. I think the second piece is now you have a full recording of the entire encounter, potentially into perpetuity. So, one of the major things I do when I talk about integrating a AI scribe platform is I ask the question of, is this AI recording? Is it audio? And is there any video component? Where is it saved? Is it saved? And then is it dumped? So most of these platforms will actually dump the transcription within about 72 hours is fairly standard,
Hmm.
which means that it is actually not subpoenable. That being said, you can't promise that. So at a system level, I think about this all the time. And I think about what happens if one AI scribe in a hallway, right? Like we have a lot of that, catches something on another encounter. Could that be corroborated, especially with an AI engine to figure out where things came from the same place and same time? Could that be corroborated into a very different story in a situation of malpractice?
Yeah. You'd said that scribe and AI scribe is one of the most common use scenarios you see. What's the second?
The second is definitely billing. So, back before 2023 in emergency medicine, right, it was pretty clear like you had this many physical exam findings, this many review systems, this many history components. And since 2023, it's gotten a lot more complex because of, the medical decision making. I did consider these things, but didn't do X, Y, or Z. I think AI revenue cycle coding has a lot of potential. Let me put it that way. I think there are a lot of revenue cycle companies that are live with AI coding, usually with the oversight, at least, of human coders. But again, I think that there is, because it's not just counting the history elements and the physical elements and the review assistant elements, I think you're highly dependent on how well that particular engine can interpret language, right? And that's the question of NLP, or natural language processing. Um, so I'm very hesitant to say where is this going to go. Obviously, there's a lot of lawsuits when you overcode. Like there's lots of insurances that have sued various emergency medicine physician practices over this exact issue. So I do have a great question mark of what happens when inevitably the question of overcoding or other compliance issues comes up with these platforms, and how do you open the black box of how these algorithms have learned for auditing and compliance reasons.
From what you've seen so far, is the AI assisted coding and billing, is it capturing more of the real work being done by physicians and other healthcare workers?
I actually think it's really impressive. And I oversee probably 80% emergency medicine. I oversee a lot of hospitalist medicine, anesthesia, and also surgery. In surgery in particular, I am very impressed because those CPTs are so nuanced across the different specialties of what it catches. And in emergency medicine, same thing. I'm someone that documents ED courses a lot, like live dynamic changes. Hey, I looked at this lab. This is how it changed my thought, and I am robustly impressed by how these AI platforms are doing compared to coders who, admittedly, frequently offshore, frequently English as a second language, and frequently have less than 60 seconds to code the chart and move on.
Yeah. I love that you said robustly.
Yeah.
And what I'll say is, I've worked in basically every department I've worked in. I thought there has been under capture of the point of care ultrasound we're utilizing, the coding, the billing, but also because it requires a note writing and hitting all the elements as well as archiving the image. Have you
Mhm.
seen anything specific with point of care ultrasound?
I have, and it's actually one of the things that worries me. So, my toxic trait is I am a ghost scanner, as our ultrasound directors like to say. So, I grab the ultrasound, I know. I grab the ultrasound, I scan, I'm like, I have my answer. And then I don't save or document it. Like I am the worst. It is my single toxic trait. That being said, I actually usually do not document a formal procedure note because I know I didn't have appropriate capture, and I work in revenue cycle, so I know that that is one of the major compliance and quality concerns with point of care ultrasound. So where I get worried is other ghost scanners like me frequently will say like bedside ultrasound, no abscess, so we'll give antibiotics for cellulitis. And that is technically not billable because there's not enough within that note. But what I'm seeing in these AI platforms is because they mentioned it. They clearly did it, and they did have a result, right? No abscess, that they're assigning the independent CPT. So let's pretend that it just, by verbalizing, you got enough of your note to bill. We didn't save the image and no one QA'd it. So I have concerns that we actually end up over capturing some of those sort of issues, which is actually an interesting problem to have since I'm with you. I think POCUS is something that is notoriously under captured because of ghost scanners and also because of just coding misses.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm so glad we're going down this pathway because I think within the point of care ultrasound, audience may know it as emergency ultrasound. Sometimes we call it clinical ultrasound, but in our world, we have found it a challenge to figure out how to, increase the efficiency of the workflow so that we have decreased ghost scanning. Do you have any ideas? Like, as someone who's sort of you've outed yourself in this way, and I appreciate the candor. In fact, it's the only way we move things forward is how to figure out, like, what do you think would change that practice in your practice?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because it's like I know the rubric and I'm not following it. Like I am pretty honest that I'm not following it. I think the major issue is the workflow is not clean. At no hospital system, actually one was actually fairly clean, has an integration between the ultrasound machine and the EHR been perfect. And that's usually connected through something called an HL7, where
Yep.
you send the result and the order across, and it just has to be integrated really well. No hospital system, barring one which was pretty good, has done an excellent integration. And there's all sorts of products out there. There's like Butterfly is probably the most well-known one of a software platform that integrates into EHRs. But depending on who integrates it, which is usually not a clinical team, like the clinical team gets told after the fact, but
Mm-hmm.
depending on who integrates it, it probably isn't smooth. So in the example I gave, like I've seen multiple ultrasound um, products like Butterfly integrated with the radiology software beautifully, like PACS basically. So it shows them in PACS, you can put a result there, wonderful. But it doesn't integrate onto where we document, which is probably a different module of the EHR. So now it's clunky. Now you're trying to link something called an ascension number, which is how they link radiology images over to, MRNs and CSNs, which is how we think about encounters in, on the clinical, like bedside side, and it's clunky. So for me to do an ultrasound and do it properly, I have to type in things onto the actual machine. I have to scan things on the actual machine. I have to put the result in actually two places in the EHR because it doesn't integrate. So I think we need to clean up the workflow. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, right, that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
And there needs to be an impetus to do it.
You highlighted so many reasons why I really dug deep into healthcare design because we need to be at the table. We need to be the clinicians at the beginning, sitting at the table as these workflows, as these tools, both the hardware and the software, are being designed
Mhm.
so that it actually is efficient and it is user friendly. And so we don't have the ghost scanning. So, like, yeah, this is like a textbook example of something many of us have been working on for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, talk to your friendly neighborhood informaticist. Like that's usually a thing we're impassioned about. And there's usually someone who's, let's call them a super user, that's also extremely just invested in it, maybe just loves ultrasound and could be a champion because it just can't be you. So that's
Yeah.
my governance model is have an informaticist, have a leader like the ultrasound director, and then make sure you have at least one or two champions that will help you with the rollout. And I have never met a analyst team because I call the teams that actually do the building in the EHR analysts, usually non-clinical. Sometimes they have backgrounds in like nursing, most commonly. But I have never met one that is not so excited to have invested clinical stakeholders that help them decide. Otherwise, they just pick because they're like, yeah, that seems good, but they don't
Yeah.
know.
100%. Consent. What is your feeling on consent, and should we be telling patients when we're using AI assisted tools or software, et cetera?
My opinion is always, 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 always tell the patient and document your consent, which I think can just be verbal. That being said, what's really interesting at a working in leadership at a group that is in many states is there's actually state laws that will help establish that. So, for example, some say you have to explicitly have signage posting saying that you're recording. And I've talked to various AI platforms that have tried to claim that they're not really recording because they don't actually save the audio on their servers. They only save the transcription, which I find that just like a nuance. I just don't want to sit in that courtroom when it comes up. So from a protection standpoint, I tell physicians who are interested in AI platforms two things. One, never, ever, ever go it alone. Do not just sign up and start using it because you need to run it by your hospital and say, hey, is it okay? Is this a violation of patients? Do we need it formally in the consent and registration? Do we need signage? What is the state law? So I think that's the number one protective thing. And then the number two protective thing is exactly what you say. Tell the patient. And I think it's fair to tell the patient if there is AI involved in their medical care at all or documentation. So even if you're using AI for like medical decision making, which there's a lot of more education based platforms that people use, I usually tell them as well.
Yeah. Arguably, we've all been practicing emergency medicine with AI for decades because even the EKGs we perform,
Hmm.
although it's, dinosaur type of AI, it's still AI in terms of the algorithm. It's just not a learning model. So, how do we retrospectively even acknowledge that there's been AI in our medical practice for a very long time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it opens up the question, right? I mean, you made a really good point. There is AI for a long time. There's certainly like clinical decision support, which is just explicit logical rules, which we've kind of consented, I guess, in hospital registration. But I think the difference in the past few years, and I think ChatGPT from a layperson perspective really blew up what is AI, which is truly machine learning, is the amount of data and the amount of information, audio, video, et cetera, that you can take and actually process. Because that is completely new, the degree. Like this is not thousands of rows, millions of rows of data. This is billions upon billions of rows that then get, mapped into a neural network so some algorithm can go and decide things for us. So I think because of that, it's actually opened up the question for me of like, is HIPAA even that relevant? Because your information is out there, right? Experian has had violations and there's class action suits. Like your data is like your social security has probably been leaked in something. So is HIPAA almost a dinosaur when you're thinking about the amount of information stored on these massive servers? And even if your information is secure, that's one thing, your information might still be being used for training sets. Like, does that need consent? And even if it's de-identified, most of these platforms do use their de-identified customer information for training sets. Like, so how do I know 10 years from now the models have not evolved so much that they can go back to circa 2025 information and say, oh, that was Dr. Amy Ho talking to patient Jason Smith. Like, we don't know. So it just opens this interesting question of, I don't think HIPAA is as simple as, don't release patient names and date of births anymore. I think the whole idea of it needs to be revisited.
Yeah. Yeah. So at the beginning of the program in my intro, I talked about all the hats you've worn or all the things you like to do: reading, writing, arithmetic, storytelling, TV, podcasting, and now informatics. Describe for someone that may not understand this sort of liberal arts journey in medicine, how it all makes sense to you.
I think at the fundamental, I love storytelling. I love storytelling, literally telling stories, and writing, etc. I feel like patients tell us stories all the time. That's actually what an HPI is to me. And I feel like patients tell us stories, obviously, about their chest pain, but you get a lot of color. Like, I mean, in my patient population, like, why didn't you come to hospital? They're like, well, when the administration changed, a lot of them actually got really scared. So that was a fascinating thing to see. So taking this, starting with this kernel of I love storytelling and I love resharing those stories for the purpose of primarily advocacy and sometimes educating people that are voting but may not understand healthcare. Informatics is actually just telling stories with data and reports. That's actually what got me really involved in informatics. Was someone showed me a report. They said my admission rate for like heart failure was 100%. And I was like, it's not. Like, no. And then that got me extraordinarily interested in like, well, how did you define heart failure? Did you look at echoes? Did you use diagnoses? What do you qualify as an admission? Did your odds go into that? Hey, I didn't admit the patient, but the patient got admitted after I obs them and you attribute it to me, but that was a misattribution. So that's what got me really interested in telling a story. And even as I create reports for my day job now and say how are our different markets and different physicians comparing to one another, like I love adding that color. Like we have For example, we have a person, when we look at CT utilization, his is through the roof. His CT head utilization is like twice anyone else. But the color that you miss if you're not a physician in the story is he only works trauma shifts. So all he sees are people that hit their head and, meet all the various criteria that make CT heads appropriate. When I look across all the things that I like to do, it's that I like to tell a story because I like to create knowledge and I like to be very specifically create actionable knowledge for someone, whether it's a voter, whether it's a viewer, or whether it's, one of the physicians working within my group.
I echo exactly what you just shared. We are the witness to a story of every single patient that's ever told us their history and why they came to the hospital. And they say if you listen to the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong with them even. So like
Hmm.
they're an active player in their story, which we know. But not only are we receiving and collating and putting it in the EHR, we're then retelling the story when we speak with the consultant or
Hmm.
the caretaker or the primary care provider. And so like, it's just storytelling is everywhere in our work, but I think people don't see that that's what we as doctors do. And I love the texture you just added of the informatics of like just even telling a crisper, more accurate story.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny what you say that ER doctors don't think they're storytellers. I hear the same thing from my colleagues, but you walk by any workroom and they are all telling stories of
Yeah.
the interesting patients and the interesting cases they saw. So I'm like, we are literally telling stories every single day. And it's
Yeah.
almost like it's so routine to us. We don't realize the specialness in it, but we love it.
Yeah. Well, and we know when we go to dinner parties and we're one of the only physicians there, people love those
Oh,
stories. But
yes. Oh, yes.
for listeners that want to follow you and your work and your storytelling, what's the best way?
I'm always happy to talk to anyone, so you can find me on Twitter at Amy Faith Ho. You can also email me at amy@amyfaith.home. That's also my website, amyfaithho.com. So pretty easy to remember.
The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Find me at Resa E. Lewis MD on social media or visit thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our episodes on YouTube. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect the opinions of their institutions. Information shared here should never substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice. Together, we're making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time.